I'm Marion Phillips III, the Senior Vice President of Community Development and DEI at U.S. News and World Report. And we are thrilled to be out in San Francisco at SOCAP24. I say that because we really are, as a company, happy to be here. As a New Yorker, do you all know it's 12 noon and what time I got out of bed out here? Having said that, at U.S. News, we have a saying, and we echo what many public health experts say, that your zip code is just as important, maybe even more so, than your genetic code. And what we mean by that is the factors that influence your health, the quality of care available to you, and the well-being of your community are deeply intertwined with where you live, what that means in terms of your access to good jobs, nutritious food, affordable housing, clean air, clean water, and many, many other aspects. A community is not just a geographical concept, but it's also a holistic construct, meaning a place where different people live with the same basic needs to thrive. We all need financial institutions. We all need grocery stores. We all need hospitals. We all need housing. We all need schools. We all need parks and small businesses. Communities that are just a couple of miles apart in around big cities like New York, Chicago, and yes, even San Francisco, for instance, can vary by a decade or more in terms of life expectancy. And that's a challenge that policymakers and stakeholders at all levels need to reckon with. And we take seriously our role as conveners of the kinds of important conversations we're going to have today. In August of just about every year, U.S. News releases the Healthiest Communities rankings. This past August, we released the 6th edition of these Healthiest Communities rankings. And we have 6 years of data. And the reason I highlight that is we have 6 years of data on 2,800 different counties across America. And this data, when you look at it across 6 years, shows very limited fluctuation. And I want to highlight that to you to let you know that it's not that easy to change that decade differential of life expectancy. And so we pair this data-rich analysis with in-depth reporting based on data. Our journalists have recently written about the United States. We spend more money than other high-income countries, and we rank at the very bottom. And when it comes to providing equitable access to care and its ability to help Americans achieve good health outcomes, we've covered issues like mental health and dramatic disparities in infant and maternal health in great detail. And it's not hard to see, even if it's difficult to look at, how economic equity, or the lack thereof, drives this. You can't afford fresh fruit, or if you don't live anywhere within a reasonable distance to buy fresh fruit, you're not going to be healthy. If you rely on public transportation to get to work and the prices increase, your finances take a hit. If more people smoke, if crime is higher, if fewer people have access to mental health services, chances are the health of your community will suffer. And when you look at our data, Virginia and Iowa are each home to 4 of the top 20 healthiest communities. These include Falls Church, Virginia, which is our #1 community in our rankings, which excels in education, economy, food, nutrition, infrastructure, and so on. The states with the highest average overall community level scores, Rhode Island, Iowa, New Hampshire. The states with the lowest scores, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. So I encourage you to go to our website, usnews.com, plug in your zip code, see where you live and how it ranks. It's right under Healthiest Communities. And just determine where you rank. Now understand, when you look at these rankings and you look at where you place your zip code, here's what you're going to discover. This is the cheat piece. You're going to say, I live near a hospital. Well, your county's much larger than where you live. And an example, my beloved city of New York, the borough of Manhattan, does not have a hospital south of 28th Street. That covers all of Chelsea, covers the Wall Street, covers City Hall. It covers the Village. So everything south of 28th Street, from river to river, does not have health care. Yet, Manhattan has some of the finest healthcare facilities in the world. Well, let's just dig a little deeper for a minute and I'll get out of your way. I want to spread this message of equity. I want to spread this message of healthiest communities. And I want to challenge you to dig deeper in all the tasks that you do and tasks that you perform. And how do we improve our individual communities, because we're going to improve the individual lives of our neighbors. And when you dig deeper, you will understand exactly what it means. You'll understand what it means that the need for small businesses in our communities. More than 99% of all American businesses are small businesses. They employ over 61.7 million people in this country, according to our US SBA. And that is why when we talk about healthiest communities, we just don't mean the top-down, high-level institutions, but we mean the local bodega, we mean the barbershop, we mean the bakery, we mean the butcher, and in some way that ensuring that programs and opportunities exist for all people, regardless of their race, their education level, and their access to opportunities. We must do the same for businesses of all sizes and all stripes. Small businesses have been hit hard by economic conditions in recent years. COVID pandemic. Of course, we know that. It took a high toll on not only the businesses, but the employees. It took a toll not only on the businesses, the employees, but it also took a toll on the people. And then the attacks on equity and the emerging anti-DEI forces that have also become more vocal in recent years are also threatening the well-being and economic freedom of any minority-owned businesses and marginalized people. This is a federal issue. This is a state issue. This is a local issue. This is a people issue. And it's our responsibility to learn it, speak up, and bring about change. Well, fortunately today, I have the honor of bringing together two leaders who happen to be friends of a couple of decades. So I want to introduce to you Alphonso David, who is the president and chief executive of the Global Black Economic Forum, as well as a distinguished civil rights attorney and advocate who has represented the Fearless Fund, an Atlanta-based venture capital fund that invests in under-resourced entrepreneurs and businesses to help broaden economic opportunity for all. He will come and share the work that he's doing and the work that he is unfortunately defending. Another dear friend is Pravina Raghavan. She is the director of the U.S. Department of Treasury's CDFI. As you know, CDFI supports some of our nation's most distressed communities by offering tailored resources and programs that invest federal dollars alongside private sector capital. Prior to her being at Treasury, she was at SBA. Prior to that, she was at Empire State Development, which is the state economic engine for New York State. Leading this conversation will be my colleague, Stephen Ross Johnson, our public health reporter.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. A couple housekeeping notes before we start our conversation. Last 10 minutes of this session will be open to the audience for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and one of our volunteers will come by with a card for you to write down, and they'll pass it to me, and if time permits, then I will read it off. So let's get started. Thank you very much to our esteemed panel for joining us. Let me just start with a kind of a broader question for the both of you. How have efforts to advance economic equity evolved in recent years? And direct the first question to Pravina, please.
Well, thank you very much for having us here. I'm really excited to talk about this issue. Also, I want you to know I haven't known Marion for decades because that ages me. I've only known him for 2 years. That's about it. I'm exactly 21. Okay. So, it's actually interesting you saying about, advancing and how equity is involved. So the CDFI fund, we just had our 30th anniversary. So we've been around for 30 years, really promoting financial inclusion in communities. And you think, well, that's great. And as the director, I always say my objective is to never have a CDFI fund again, because then we would have financial inclusion everywhere. But financial inclusion doesn't just mean a bank account or an ability to get a loan, but also to have affordable housing, to have a downtown that you feel safe in. And so what we do is we invest in that. And we've seen unprecedented growth over the last actually 5 years. So the COVID pandemic was a great example of this very well kept secret called the CDFI, Community Development Financial Institutions, which are both banks, credit unions, and loan funds that work in distressed and underserved communities. And what was interesting was billions of dollars were being poured into the CDFI industry because they got into communities that other people couldn't get into. So think of language barriers, think of immigration status barriers, think of anything that would say, hey, I don't have a branch there, why would I give them a loan? Well, we'll give them a loan. Not only will we give them a loan, but they had grant programs. And then in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, you had a lot of philanthropy as well as corporations come in, Fortune 500, saying, we're going to invest in there. Let's go and give about money. These people know the community. And then finally, just recently, the EPA has put a $27 billion investment in economic justice, like looking at climate and economic justice and helping those communities. But what does that tell you? It keeps going on. But we were saying, hey, it's going to stop, and that's exactly what happened. This year, no big announcements from corporations, Fortune 500. These CDFIs are still there, yet they've grown. There are over 1,500 in the country, and they continually go into these communities to raise up the economic opportunity. So you see it. There's definitely a need. And interesting enough, Vice President Harris, as well as the Secretary of Treasury, announced the Economic Opportunity Council, which is a nonprofit council that actually has the largest financial institutions depositing money into minorities and CDFIs, because deposits are the way you can do more loans and have more financial assistance come out. And they pledged to do $1 billion. They did $1 billion. So these companies all rose up and said, we will put $1 billion of deposits. And the growth of it is, how can we get more people to invest? Because what they do, everyone says is great, but you need to make sure they're also invested just like we do in banks. And I keep telling people they're the least risky asset you're going to have, because people ask me how many have gone bankrupt over the 30 years. I'm like, I think maybe 2 or 3. But if I asked you how many banks went bankrupt last year, you could probably name them all right down the banks. This is because they're community-based, really looking at what affects their community and how do we grow that.
Thank you. Thank you. And Alphonso, same question. How have efforts to advance economic equity evolved in recent years?
Well, thank you. And thank you to U.S. News for inviting me to participate. And I agree. I think I've only known Marion for 5 years. I don't know what he's talking about. Exactly. Who is Marion? I think when I personally think about the issues of economic equity, I look at it through the lens of history. And for quite some time, we've recognized that people of color, women, marginalized communities have had difficulty, and in some cases, the doors have been closed for them to attain generational wealth. And so we've recognized that history, and as a result, we've created systems and programs to try to resolve those issues, whether it's the Minority and Women Business Program at the Department of Commerce, or the local, state, and local agencies, I should say, that are looking to create opportunities for marginalized communities that have been excluded. What I think we're confronting today is this really interesting confluence of factors where some folks are denying the history, that this either didn't happen or the opportunities didn't exist, and at the same time denying the solutions that have been created to solve the problems. So I'll give you an example. We have an agency called MBDA, Minority Business Development Agency. It was created in the 1960s by Richard Nixon. And the agency was created because minority businesses were being denied opportunities with the federal government. As you all know, the federal government allocates billions of dollars through the contracting process every year. And minority businesses were being denied those opportunities, so they created this agency under the Department of Commerce called MBDA. That agency was recently sued. The argument is, by providing benefits, resources, support to minority contractors, it constitutes discrimination because those resources are not being provided to the majority groups, meaning largely white men, and to some extent women, because this doesn't include white women either. And what was fascinating about, and what continues to be fascinating to me about this case, is the court in Texas concluded that in 93% of the cases, 93, minority contractors face bias in trying to obtain contracts with the federal government. And yet, the court concluded that the agency's program is both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. As a result, it is unconstitutional. And the reason I give you that example is because we are recognizing that a problem exists, and then we're taking away the solution to address that problem. So when we think about economic opportunity, that is one prism that we currently operate in, which is recognizing the problem, taking away the solution. The second paradigm or prism that we operate in, I think, is technology, global technology. And what we're seeing is technology is opening up the doors for economic opportunity for groups that have been struggling to attain either generational wealth or economic opportunity or just access for decades. Whether you're talking on the continent of Africa or in South America or Europe or right here in the States, technology is opening up the doors for folks that have been excluded because it allows a level of innovation. We still have an access problem, but it allows a level of innovation that I think opens up the door for economic opportunity for marginalized communities. So I think that's what we're seeing, and that's exciting, despite some of the obstacles that we continue to confront.
Thank you for that. And your mention of the current litigation that's going on, legal challenges that are going on, segues perfectly into one of the questions I have for you in terms of how do you navigate in this type of environment now? I mean, you personally, I mean, you have you're the perfect person to ask this regarding the lawsuit against the Fearless Fund. I mean, how do you navigate now with this? And are you concerned that it's going to discourage investors from investing in these types of initiatives?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question by giving you a little bit of context. We are tracking lawsuits being filed against largely black and brown entrepreneurs all over the country. And there was a period of time where we saw 2 lawsuits being filed every week all over the country in federal courts. And the cases that are being filed are challenging grant programs and, in some cases, charitable programs by these organizations. And the basic argument is, if you are providing services, resources, or grants to one marginalized community, whether it be black women or Latino men, or you just pick the marginalized community. If you're providing those resources to that demographic and not providing it to other demographic groups, it constitutes a violation of federal law. Now, we disagree, but that's the theory. And our opponents are using a statute called 1981 of the Civil Rights Act. Indulge me for a minute because I think it's important. 1981 of the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1866 after the Civil War. So as you all may know, during the Civil War, black people couldn't get an education, couldn't enter into a contract, couldn't own property. So this statute was passed in 1866 after the Civil War to essentially allow black people to enter into contracts in the same way that white people can. And that statute has been in the books for decades. It essentially says we have the ability to enter into contracts. What our opponents are now saying is that if you enter into a contract and that contract is limited to a certain racial group or ethnic group, it violates 1981 because it is reverse discrimination. The only problem with that argument is that in our case, in the Fearless Fund case, they were a venture capital firm. All of you, I assume, know what venture capitalism is. I own a company. I'm looking for investors. I find an investor. They provide me with $50 million, $100,000, $50,000, whatever the number is, In exchange, I gave them a portion of equity of my company, 1%, 2%, 5%. That's venture capitalism. The owner of the Fearless Fund was looking for investors and kept on confronting obstacles. Doors were being closed. No, 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 no. So she created her company, and her company's goal is to provide resources and support to women of color all over the country that are confronting the same problem. Now, what is the scope of the problem? $288 billion is allocated in the venture capital space every year. $288 billion with a B. Of the $288 billion, guess the percentage that goes to black women.
Less than 5.
Less than 5. Anyone else? 10% and 1%. 0.036%. 0.036% of the $288 billion goes to black women, and less than 1% goes to all black people. That's the problem she's trying to fix. So she creates this company, as well as a charitable organization, to provide resources and grants. And our opponents are saying, by doing that, it constitutes discrimination. And my response is, what about the $288 billion that they're not getting? How is that not discrimination? You're either suggesting they're unqualified, you're either suggesting their business ventures are not viable, and you're suggesting that all black women and all black people have the same problem. So we argued the case in federal district court, and we won at the district court. And there were several arguments that the court found very persuasive. And there's something for all of you to be mindful of. The Fearless Fund was issuing grants, many grants. There was one program that was limited to black women, but there were other programs that were open to all women of color. They challenged the one program that was limited to black women, and they said it constitutes discrimination. And we argued, well, we disagree, but even if it were to constitute discrimination, they're a charitable organization. Charitable organizations have a First Amendment right to issue grants consistent with their mission. Think of the Ford Foundation or the Mellon Foundation or any charitable organization, the Hebrew Burial Society, the Italian American organization. They all issue grants, resources, and support only to their demographic group. And it's been legal for decades. Under the First Amendment, it's protected. Why is it different here? The court agreed. The court also said they were unlikely to succeed on the merits. They filed an appeal to the 11th Circuit, and we argued before 3 judges, and 2 of the 3 judges concluded that they were likely to succeed on the merits. A reversal of the district court. That should be concerning to all of you in this room, because for a number of reasons. And then I'll talk to you about how the case resolved and what it means for folks in the room. I think there are 2 things that are concerning. One, the case was filed with anonymous plaintiffs. We don't know who they are. We don't know if they own legitimate businesses. We don't know if they could have applied and won. And the appellate court found that they had standing to sue, even though we don't know who they are. That should be concerning to you if you run a charitable organization or if you run a business, because they filed a preliminary injunction. For the non-lawyers in the room, you file a complaint, and then you file a preliminary injunction together with the complaint. The preliminary injunction is seeking emergency relief. You're saying, I want to stop this program right away. And so court stopped them from doing whatever they're doing because it's disproportionately impacting my clients. The problem is, if I don't know who your clients are and I cannot probe the veracity of the claims that they're advancing, you then have the ability to go into any company in this country or any charitable organization and shut them down without them having the ability to figure out whether or not your claims are real. And so that is what the 11th Circuit upheld. The Second Circuit in New York rejected that argument because it was the same lawsuit filed against Pfizer, and the court said no. Pfizer cannot defend itself without knowing who the claimants are. We need to know what their claims are. We need to probe the veracity of their claims. But again, that I think is one of the takeaways from the Fearless Fund case that everyone in this room should be concerned about. The second is that if you are a charitable organization and you are issuing grants consistent with your mission, and you are in the 11th Circuit, you have to be concerned about the ruling that the court just issued, because they were not applying the First Amendment principles in the same way they have applied in all other cases. You could argue a selective enforcement, which is what I believe it is, because it doesn't make any sense, and that should be concerning to everyone in this room. The silver lining of this case is that we were able to settle the case without it impacting the Fearless Fund moving forward. What does that mean? The settlement does not relate to any programs, services, grants that the Fearless Fund conducts moving forward. The plaintiffs in our case wanted us to essentially change all of their programs and make it race neutral. And we said, no, that actually undermines the purpose of this organization. It guts why they exist. And we rejected that theory. And we were able to successfully navigate the settlement process so that the settlement only applies to that one program that was ending anyway. It doesn't apply to anything else that they do. And the Fearless Fund just announced a $200 million grant program for under-resourced entrepreneurs. So having said all of that, what does it mean for you? In the current environment that we live in, the law has not changed. The environment has. And that's important for you to know. What I often say to our clients and to charitable organizations is it's more important from a risk perspective how you communicate your programs on your website than it is actually what you're doing. With the Fearless Fund, they unfortunately had some language on their website that referenced the word contract. And you would argue, I think many of you in this room, if you are running a charitable program, it probably is a contract. I'm giving you $20,000. You have to perform a service. In exchange, in 6 months, you have to give me a report as to what you did. Is that a contract or not? They used the word contract, and as a result, 1981 was invoked. But the 1981 statute is not invoked if there is no contract. So that's important for you to know as you navigate this space. And I think finally, we are still experiencing an environment where we see more and more lawsuits being filed. These lawsuits are not necessarily successful. The law has not changed. The climate has changed because the goal of these lawsuits is to create a chilling effect, to make all of you believe that you cannot create a program to address systemic inequities. And that is simply not true. You can continue to do these programs, you just have to do them in a way that reduces your risk. And that means using certain language. That means engaging with the community in such a way that you're addressing the systemic inequities based on data. And that means communicating with your funders or your recipients in a way that protects you, if you will. And I can talk to you about that in more detail. But generally speaking, the law has not changed, just the environment has. I know that was a long-winded answer, but there was a lot to get in.
Thank you for that. There has been a historic increase in demand for CDFI fund resources as of late. What is driving this demand, do you think, and how can CDFI fund serve this demand on a sustainable basis?
Great question. I will say the last year alone, the CDFIs from our financial assistance program did $57.7 billion in loans and investments across the country. Just to give you an idea, that's a 170% increase from 2019. So if you look at that, you can see there's a huge amount of demand to get products and services out to communities. We spent $3 billion last year in trying to get more money out. I'm hampered by my friends in Congress. I love them very dearly. My budget is at their disposal. It's like having dysfunctional divorced parents. So it's great. You get a check and you try to spend it as quickly as possible. But what we've been trying to do is get other investors and other people interested, because it's not sustainable on just the ability of the government, and whether it's federal or state, to just have these communities continually having investment in them. To give you an idea, CDFIs are only 1% of the total assets in the banking industry. So if you think about a several trillion-dollar industry, they represent their assets in total of all 1,500 are less than 1%. So, and they are the ones going into these communities. So from a sustainability point of view, my last round, where I had $400 million to give out, we had $1.5 billion worth of applications saying, and that's from CDFIs just to go into communities. We also do the new market tax credit. It's a $5 billion program to help with affordable housing, community centers, childcare centers. We have 4 times the demand of the $5 billion, right? And we're going to do a double round this year. It's just continually showing that these distressed communities have a large need that is out proportion. So what we at the CDFI Fund are trying to do is figure out how to bring other investors into in with us. And when I mean other investors, we invest into a CDFI, we certify them first, and then they can apply for our funding. But that certification has value, because the banks, with the new rewrite of the Community Reinvestment Act, automatically get credit for supporting community development financial institutions. So we're like, okay, how do we bring more banks into that? But those are mostly loans. And if you run a business, having a lot of loans on your balance sheet, not the best thing. How do we bring in philanthropy and other corporations to start putting in like deposits into these institutions? Because then they can loan on that. And if they're not a depository institution, how do we get them to invest, to give a loan at a cheaper rate, so that they can purchase loans and get them off the balance sheet and do more. And the reason I say this is I'm probably going to always be, I keep asking for $1 billion, but I don't know if that's going to happen, but I get about 325 million, but our companies leverage that 8 to 9 times. So, and we still have more demand. So it's about bringing data, and that's what we're doing with 1,500 CDFIs. I can tell you the asset classes, I can tell you their default rates, I can tell you where they stand across the country, what they're supporting, and to bring that out into the public so we can get more stakeholders in there, because I'm the only one who holds all that data, because every year all 1,500 have to tell me where they're spending their money, because they're accountable for their loan products to be in those communities. They can't do it outside those communities.
With so much demand, how do you identify major social needs within the communities and that you're satisfying those with the?
So it's a great question. You know what? These are in the community. So the community development financial institutions are in. So they work with their communities to figure out what products work. A lot of times it's things like even credit building loans. Like you're in a community, people don't even have bank accounts. And that you're like, wait, you don't have a bank account? What's interesting is the power of the phone. You can have a bank account by your phone, but how do you manage that? And so they have classes on that. And then they do these credit building loans, and they actually modify their products. And the way our funding works is we sit as an asset on their balance sheet. So we say, hey, you have a broad spectrum you can do. If you need childcare centers in your community, go fund childcare. If you need to fund, more affordable housing, we just gave out $460 million for affordable housing. Let's go and do that. But it is really the CDFIs that determine what their community needs, and they do that based on the engagement. And the way we check that, because, it's great to say you're going to do it, is we get your actual transaction. So if you told me you're going to help low-income people and all your loans are going to people who have a not 80% AMI, a medium income, then I know. And then you get decertified, because I'm like, you are trading on the value of us looking at your certification. So we do a lot of check and balance, but a lot of the influence just comes from the community. We had a project in I'm going to say DC, even though because I'm not there. There's a place where the Navy Yard is by 11th Street, and they were revitalizing the community. Well, when you hear revitalizing community, means usually people are going to be pushed out who live in the community. Well, the CDFI actually worked with both the city and the federal, say, hey, here's money that we got from the fund. We're going to invest it in a community center. We're going to invest it to have an elevated park, and gave the voice to the community. Because if it had been up to the city developers, they would have built something, high-rise complexes, and air goes out the community. And so people are like, well, that's not money. I said, yeah, they're financially invested maybe several million, so it's not the big project, but it was their voice to be able to say, because we're in the community, we need to continually support them. And so that's how we get a lot of the feedback that we did in the pandemic, was a plethora of showing us what's needed in these communities.
see. One of the more innovative ideas that have been implemented in recent years has been idea of universal basic income for communities. Um, I believe it started in Stockton, California, and now pilot projects have been in several communities throughout the country. I'm just curious, are there other types of programs you'd like to see communities experiment with to kind of gauge their efficacy in addressing socioeconomic inequities? And I'll both.
Yep, sure. I think it's really innovative to be able to do that. I think that's what we're talking about, the innovation in the CDFI industry. We have something. We gave $1 billion to the Equitable Recovery Program, which is exactly looking at that, looking at income and knowing the racial. Most of our programs, we can't actually ask the question, "What are you?" Right? What are you? Because we'll get legally challenged, but also banking regulations, because we have a lot of banks. They're not allowed to. It's the ECOA, which is the Equal Credit Act, to make sure, because people would be if you say you're Asian American, they're like, oh, I'm not giving you a loan, move you to this pile. So to avoid that, banks can't ask that question. But what was interesting with the Equitable Recovery Program is we got it written in the statute that you had to ask the question, because we wanted to see what the data is going to tell us. It wasn't challenged, so the $1 billion went out, which is good. And really what it is trying to figure out, is there an innovative model that we can use for the lending products that can be then used across the country? Because we want to know that data of what's going into low-income targeted populations. We also do one that's called the Persistent Poverty County. We have CDFIs that go in there, and that means that this county has been persistently poverty-stricken for 20 years, right? So there's a statistical database. What makeup of what ethnicity makeup, we don't know, but we know that they have traditionally been underserved. And then we give more money to those communities to build products to help them become there. Because I think you're right, economic opportunity starts with owning a home and building assets, and then being able to pass it on. But if you don't even have the ability to even cash a check, which we found out in some of these, someone went and said, oh, someone bought my house for $10,000, and the CDFI is like, $10,000, your house has got to be worth more than that. She's like, I've never had this kind of check. So it's about trying to put the checks and balances in there so that the community can continually work. So that's how some of the efforts we've been doing, where we can use data, but also knowing that we sit on a cross line of where the legality may be for programs.
I think there are a lot of programs that local communities are implementing. I'll just reference two. One is addressing predatory lending. So predatory lending practices, unfortunately, have been sanctioned in so many parts of the country. If you live in a major city, or maybe not, on a given Friday afternoon around 3, 4, 5 o'clock, you can always drive by these locations, and there's a huge line, people trying to cash their checks. And it may be a check for $400, and after the check is cashed, they're getting $350, maybe $4. And these systems have been sanctioned, as I said, and we're looking for interesting ways to address them. There have been legal challenges. Unfortunately, they have not been successful. But we have organizations and companies that are creating alternatives for folks who have been subject to payday lending and payday loans, and the predatory practices generally. And they're creating these alternatives using the web and using apps where you can actually work with these companies to make sure that credit history is not just the only marker in determining whether or not you're going to pay the loan back. They have all of these other indicia that they look to determine your viability or your likelihood of responding to or paying the loan back. And they've been able to be quite successful in many parts of the country. One is called Solo Funds, if you haven't heard of them, in making sure they're providing an alternative to the predatory practices. The second, I would say, is we've seen an increase in minority and women business enterprise programs all over the country, and I think that's important for a lot of reasons. It will surprise you to know that in state after state after state, when we look at the data, women and racial minorities are denied opportunities when they want to enter into government contracting. And there's no other answer other than based on their demographic, because the data is unfortunately consistent. And so creating these programs to create goals, to remove obstacles, to deconstruct the process so that racial minorities and women actually have an opportunity, we've seen as being quite successful. And when I worked for the state of New York, I oversaw the Minority and Women-Owned Business Program. When I took it over, and again, the state of New York allocated billions of dollars every single year, whether you're buying widgets or you're buying janitorial services. And the percentage that went to minority and women-owned businesses was 8%. After I left, 8 years later, it was 30%. So there is an ability to create opportunity for marginalized communities. You just have to look at creating new systems to address the systemic inequities that have unfortunately existed for a while.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was curious as to how do you address kind of more of the historic socioeconomic inequities. Some of those inequities that have been caused by like actual physical structures. Where you see highways being built into neighborhoods that are splitting neighborhoods, or public transit that doesn't quite reach some of the most marginalized communities. Pravina, can you give me your thoughts on those?
Sure. As I was saying, is unfortunately CDFIs can't solve everything. Otherwise, we have a lot more budget. But one, it is working with communities and trying to make sure that their voice is heard. I think when you look at clean, like especially climate, where a lot of these communities are affected, the EPA did the Green Gas Reduction Fund. And what was interesting about that is that they had accelerator grants to actually look at this into the communities that have been most affected by clean energy, by actually by pollution. And they gave over $6 billion to CDFIs that are now going to go in and look at the infrastructure. So that's solar, wind, to actually put into those communities, as opposed to, oh, it's $27 billion, it's going across the country. Well, no, we're going to statistically look in there. And that includes Native communities as well. They got over $500 million to look into. Those communities have been really dismarginalized and disproportionately. And then the Appalachian region got another 500. But across the country, they gave about $6 billion, and the CDFIs are working as a network across to make sure those communities are reflected. And I think that's part of what a lot of the programs are starting to look into. Are these communities that most hardest hit for generations? How are we putting money back into them, as opposed to saying, oh, we're just going to give $27 billion and it'll go to the same communities? Actually saying, no, we don't want those communities to get it. They'll eventually get it, but let's try to make the investment. And that's a grant program that is like, when I talk about my budget, that's, almost 10 times my budget, right? So right there and then, that's an investment that CDFIs will be helping to promote climate change in these communities.
Alphonso, you touched upon in your earlier comments regarding the movement towards kind of more of an anti-DEI movement as of late. It seems as if, after the protests, after the death of George Floyd in 2020, there seemed to be kind of a real push by certain industries to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, but now we're seeing the kind of that pushback as of late. I would love to get your thoughts as to how what impact this is having on marginalized communities and in terms of impact investing.
So a few things. We recently did a study with Korn Ferry looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion over the past 5 years. And it's on our website, the Global Black Economic Forum. It's also on Korn Ferry's website if you would like to read it. One of the interesting takeaways for me was looking at this issue through the lens of industry. You saw an increase and continue to see an increase in an embracing of diversity, equity, and inclusion, say in the financial services sector, but a decrease in commodities. And trying to understand why that is the case, I think, is one of the perplexing things that we have to confront as we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion 2.0. But we did that study because we wanted to really understand, after George Floyd was killed, there were all of these commitments made by companies all over the country about investing in marginalized communities. Unfortunately, the dollars that were promised did not end up materializing in the majority of the cases. Put that aside for a minute, though, when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as a concept, we have study after study after study that shows diversity, equity, and inclusion not only leads to higher revenues, but it leads to innovation. So if you are a chief executive officer running a company, and you've seen the data, whether it be from McKinsey or Harvard, and it shows, regardless of the industry that you operate in, if you have a diverse team, you will have higher revenues. You will be the company of the future. You will be much more innovative. What I say to many CEOs is, why would you ever take a step back from that? It's either you don't have the data, you haven't done the analysis, you just simply hired someone in a performative way to do this work, but you haven't connected the dots, or you are engaging in what I would say a breach of your fiduciary duty to ensure that you are generating revenues for the shareholders and for the company. We have this environment where people are saying companies are taking a step back from diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's its false narrative. More than 80% of companies, 83 specifically, under a most recent study, have said that they are recommitting to diversity. But yet, what we read in the press is about one or two companies that are taking a step backwards. So I think it's important that we reconceptualize what's happening before us and understand what the facts are. And then second, as I speak to a lot of reporters about this, I say I think we're asking the wrong questions. The reporter said, what do you mean? The right question is why Tractor Supply decided to do X. And I say, no, that's the wrong question. The right question is, why is it that we are not asking about the composition of the C-suite? Why are we not asking about the composition of the boardroom? Because if there are no women in that boardroom, that's a larger problem. If there are no women in the C-suite, that's a larger problem. That's why diversity, equity, and inclusion exist. And we are being distracted by one or two companies taking a, quote, step back and ignoring the problem that we still confront, which is people of color and women are being denied opportunities in the C-suite and to share and to serve on boards. And that is what we need to be addressing. So ultimately, I think we will continue to have this narrative war, if you will, but we have to keep our eyes on the prize, which is I want to see more women CEOs and more women that are in the boardrooms. But if we are constantly distracted by one or two companies who may be changing their policies, and by the way, we don't even know what they're changing, then we're sort of having the distractions lead the narrative.
And Pravina, from a public sector standpoint, I mean, how are you navigating in this kind of anti-DEI sentiment these days with, critics complaining about, government contracting policies that prioritize minority-owned businesses? How are you navigating in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Being a federal agency these days is not easy. A lot of our there's been a lot of court challenges to a lot of the things we've done. My favorite is the Chevron case. If you've never read it, feel free. But for a long time, we were able to interpret statute, and all of a sudden they're like, do exactly what the statute says. Don't make any interpretation. Well, if you've seen any of these statutes, they're many million pages long, but usually the section that affects you is a paragraph. So I got to say exactly what the paragraph says with no exceptions. That makes it difficult. And then with this onslaught of, people never thought, like MBDA, no one ever thought a federal agency would be sued. We have to navigate it the purpose of the CDF5 fund has been there for 30 years. It is to help underserved and under-resourced communities, and we stick to that. Now, what happens is if you look at the data, is most underserved communities happen to be majority minority population. But we don't say we're helping majority minority population because we will get, as rightly said, sued. But what we do is underserved. That also means we're also helping rural communities. They're very well underserved, and they may not look like the rest of America, or they may. And so we continue to bring up that it's about underserved communities. It's economically distressed communities. It doesn't matter the person's color. It doesn't matter the person's race. It's about trying to make sure that they're included and they have the same access as anyone else. And people resonate with that. They're like, yeah, no, I should be able to get a credit card. I should be able to live in a home where I don't have to worry that I can't afford it, or worse off, it's in a, there's a lot of crime in the neighborhood. And one of the good things is we have a lot of bipartisan support. We have a CDFI caucus in the Senate that has the exact same amount of Democrats as it has Republicans, and they make an effort to make sure that they keep it bipartisan. In fact, that's one of the things I said is this is not an issue that one side or the other has to decide. It's an issue that affects all of America because, as I said, at 30 years, we still have this economic disparity happening, and that's investing money over 30 years with other people. I think the other thing that we try to do, as I said, is the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, just got an entire rehaul, and it starts in 2026, where it's actually making banks invest into these communities that they didn't. Because if they can't have a retail operation, it's not worth it for them. We're like, don't worry, we have a bunch of CDFIs that'll get there, but we still have so much work to do. But it is an interesting path to sit there and watch what I'd call the war on government agencies who are trying to do exactly what their statute, which was written in 1994, do, which is to help underserved communities that have lack of financial assistance and resources and not even the ability to get them, and be able to train them and make sure that it happens.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to our panel. I think now we're going to start beginning our Q&A session where we're going to take questions from the audience.
That's a really good question that requires me to touch on just a few things. So where are we going to be in 2 years, and what does the environment look like is going to be, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective and your ideology, defined by what will happen in a week from now. The election will inform our perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion to a large extent because both presidential candidates, or the ones from the two large political parties, have ideologically different views on this issue. I think where we will be from a corporate perspective will be informed by whether we understand the narrative that is being advanced. I can assume that most people have heard about Tractor Supply. I can also assume that most people have not heard that 85%, 83% of the companies are recommitting to diversity. And the reason why that's important is because if the narrative that diversity, equity, and inclusion is dead, it will inadvertently affect companies that are recommitting to diversity. And I think our opponents know that. This is, yes, a legal challenge, but more than a legal challenge is a narrative challenge, where folks are advancing these narratives that are false, are advancing these narratives that to suggest that most companies are taking a step backwards, and they're not. JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon specifically has been fantastic on this issue. And I mean, if you haven't heard his comments, you should look it up, where he says, call me whatever you want, call me woke or non-woke. I'm focusing on the numbers. And the numbers tell me that more diverse teams lead to higher innovation and higher business results. And that's what we should be focused on, right? This is a free enterprise culture. We have capitalism and free enterprise. And if we're embracing that philosophy, then I think every company should be embracing D&I. And I think hopefully that's where we're going to be.
I was just saying, first of all, thank you for the, just organizing this forum and your participation in this. I think it's been very eye-opening for me to hear the both sides. And I loved the title of this session, Offense, Defense, which you guys did a great job of presenting the challenges and how you would address it. I have a ton of questions, so I'm not going to go through my questions. So this is all going to be sidelined. Maybe we'll have sidebar conversations. But one of my thoughts was, after hearing you, is wouldn't it be great to have a workshop session to follow up with this panel and really try to problem solve some of the ideas that you presented, given the audience and their contribution. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think it would, maybe next year or some other time you could do this, but there's a lot of bright people here we heard the question, and I think it would be interesting to hear their point of views, because you present a lot of problems and a lot of challenges and also some solutions, but there are ways around some, and I think it might be refreshing to hear that. Thank you.
So I'm going to read off some questions. The first question is for you, Pravina. How might the CDFI fund leverage additional funding by providing loan guarantees for CDFIs?
We do loan guarantee program. We have a half a $1 billion announced in first time. We have $498 million that went out of our $500 million for bond guarantee program. It's the only long-term capital program. It's 29.5-year bond that gets bought by the Federal Financing Bank, and it is issued by CDFIs that they gather. It has to be $100 million, gather other CDFIs to put them on their balance sheet. So we do the bond guarantee program. It was initiated, it's actually our 20 years ago. So we do already do bond guaranteeing purchasing. If they're talking about loan participation programs, we don't have the authority to do that, but what we are trying to do is find ways to incentivize CDFIs to start participating in loans together, but also there has to be standardization in that so that it can be rated and ranked from things like S&P. We have 16 CDFIs that are on the S&P index out of 1,500. That's not a lot, but if you asked me 10 years ago, we'd have 0. So we're trying to work with other organizations to figure out standardization so that we can create loan participation pools to buy them off that balance sheet.
Thank you. Our next question, Alphonso, how can investors / companies measure progress toward racial equity or DEI goals in today's legal political environment in a way that is non-discriminatory?
So I would say for many companies, and I've spoken to a few, which is shocking, but so ask yourselves, when you go through the process of promotions every year and you look at the data to see how many people are actually promoted, it tells you whether or not there may be implicit bias in your systems. That's one way. The other is talent pipeline. Companies hire, people retire. If you're hiring staff, where are you going? Who are you talking to? Are you recruiting from historically black colleges and universities? Are you recruiting from regional schools? Or are we only recruiting from the Ivy Leagues? That's another tool that you could utilize. The third is, I think some companies have defined diversity, equity, and inclusion to be restrictive. Diversity and inclusion includes someone with an impaired ability, includes someone from another part of the country, a region, a part of the country that will bring a perspective that's different from someone who lives in the city. So diversity, equity, and inclusion can be defined in a way that limits your exposure and also increases your bottom line or benefits you in terms of your bottom line. It doesn't, diversity and equity and inclusion does not and has never been restricted to race. And I think that's the narrative that our opponents are advancing. Oh, this is about giving a black or brown person, and that's how it's framed, a benefit that they're not entitled to, which is false. In most cases, that person has to be overqualified to get the job. But put that aside, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in many cases, white women have benefited most from diversity, equity, and inclusion. But that's not the narrative that's being advanced. So I think, one, defining it in a way that it's inclusive. Second, looking at your talent pipeline. And third, looking at things like promotions and tracking them and understanding, okay, we have 1,000 employees. We promoted or gave salary increases to 30. Look at those numbers and you will understand whether or not you have a problem within your system that you can address.
And lastly, last question for Pravina. What type of investor is being targeted to increase deposits, increase loans by CDFIs? What are some innovative products being pursued?
Yeah, so the investors into the CDFIs vary. We have obviously state and federal, local governments, but we also have philanthropy that has been a really major supporter of CDFIs, given the fact that they do something like financial literacy education, which a lot of people, you'd be amazed, don't know how to manage their finances. They didn't get taught, so things like that. And really, in the insured depositories, a lot of the banks are open to have almost anybody get an account, right? They're not like saying, oh, you can't. Part of it is to start that credit building because they expect to graduate you into a bigger bank from that way. And I would say from the philanthropy side, the investment really is the return on helping these communities. So we have a lot of partnerships, especially when it comes to affordable housing and childcare, really looking at how to build those services because the financial sector, banks will help each other, but there's not as much help in that affordable sector, housing sector, because it's either big agencies, both state and local housing companies coming together to build it. But what they're really looking at is how does that change the neighborhood? How do we bring more businesses in? Because if we don't have that retail space, people don't have a place to go get grocery stores and become healthy. So in that area, we are seeing a lot more different kind of investors because there definitely is an affordable housing crisis wherever you look. And we just announced another $100 million program this June to help with gap financing and that into these communities to make sure that we can get more affordable housing for people who are like nurses and police officers, affordable housing just for people who actually give us first responders and coming up. So that's the different innovation types that we look for.